Picture this. A woman walks into the most powerful office building in New York City. She is not there for a meeting. She is not there for an interview. She is there because 7 years ago, the man who sits on the 42nd floor looked her in the eye, shook her hand, and told her she had a future at his company. She believed him. She gave him everything, her mornings, her evenings, her holidays, her health. She missed her mother's birthday 3 years in a row. She skipped her best friend's wedding because it was a quarterly report due at 6 in the morning. She poured every single drop of herself into that company like it was her own blood running through its veins. And then one Tuesday morning, for months after the little pink lines appeared on that test she took alone in the office bathroom at 7:15 in the morning, they called her into a glass-walled conference room, slid a manila envelope across a cold table, and told her that her position had been eliminated. Not her work, not her performance, not her results. Her position. She sat in that chair for 11 seconds. She counted them, because her brain does that when the world is falling apart. It counts things and holds on to numbers because numbers do not lie. And in those 11 seconds, every single sacrifice she had ever made for that company played through her mind like a film she never agreed to star in. Then she picked up the envelope. She stood up. She smoothed her blazer over the small but unmistakable curve of her stomach. She looked the HR director in the eye, and she walked out. That was the last time anyone in that building underestimated Callie Monroe. What happened after that door closed behind her is the kind of story that people do not believe the first time they hear it. It is the kind of story that makes you sit up straighter. It makes you put your phone down. It makes you forget you were supposed to start dinner 20 minutes ago. Because what happened to Callie Monroe after she was fired for being pregnant is not a story about a woman who fell apart. It is a story about a woman who burned the whole game down and built something better from the ashes. And somewhere in the middle of all that burning and building, she walked straight into the path of the most dangerous man in the country, a man so powerful that senators returned his calls before they returned their wives, a man so controlled and so cold and so relentlessly focused that his own board of directors was afraid of him, a man who had not felt a single unexpected emotion in 11 years, until her. But before we get to him, before we get to what he did when he found out the truth, before we get to the moment that broke every wall he had ever built, you need to know who Callie was before any of this happened. You need to know what they took from her, because you cannot understand what she built unless you understand exactly what they destroyed. If this story already has your heart, do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below telling us what you think is going to happen. This community is growing every single day because of people like you. Now let's go back to Callie. Callie Monroe grew up in a small town in Ohio, where the most exciting thing that ever happened was when the Dairy Queen on Route 9 got a drive-through window. Her mother worked double shifts at the hospital for 22 years. Her father left when Callie was 6, not dramatically, not with fight or a slammed door, just quietly, the way some men do. One morning he was at the breakfast table, and the next morning he was not, and her mother never explained it, and Callie never asked because even at 6 years old she understood that some questions had answers that would hurt more than the silence. She grew up watching her mother carry everything. Every bill, every school form, every empty space at every dinner table. Her mother carried it all without complaint, without drama, and with an almost frightening level of dignity that Callie spent her entire childhood trying to understand and her entire adult life trying to replicate. She was not the prettiest girl in her school. She was not the most popular. She was a girl who read during lunch, who stayed late in the library, who applied for every scholarship she could find and wrote every essay with the kind of desperate precision of someone who understood that a single paragraph might be the difference between a future and the absence of one. She got into Ohio State on a partial scholarship and a work-study program that had her cleaning laboratory equipment at 6 in the morning before her 8 o'clock classes. She graduated with a degree in business and a 3.9 GPA and exactly $14 in her checking account. She moved to New York because that is what you do when you have nothing to lose and everything to prove. She slept on her college roommate's couch for 6 weeks. She ate peanut butter sandwiches for breakfast, and whatever her roommate's boyfriend left in the refrigerator for dinner. She applied to 112 jobs. She got 4 interviews. She got 1 offer. Holloway and Reed Capital Partners. Entry-level analyst. $41,000 a year. A cubicle on the 23rd floor next to the copy machine that jammed every single morning at exactly 8:47. So reliably that Callie started setting her internal clock by it. She was 23 years old, and she thought she had arrived somewhere. She had not arrived anywhere. She was just beginning. The thing about Callie Monroe that her supervisors noticed immediately, before her intelligence, before her attention to detail, before her almost supernatural ability to find a flaw in a financial model that 3 senior analysts had already signed off on, was that she cared. Not in a performative way that young employees sometimes do when they are trying to impress people. She cared the way her mother cared about her patients. Personally, completely, with her whole self. She stayed late not because she was told to, but because the work was not finished, and unfinished work bothered her the way an unresolved chord bothers a musician. She asked questions not to seem smart, but because she genuinely wanted to understand. She remembered things, the name of a client's daughter, the anniversary of a deal that had been difficult, the particular way a partner liked his reports formatted, not because she kept notes, but because she was paying attention when most people were just waiting for their turn to speak. Within 2 years, she had moved from analyst to associate. Within 4, she was a senior associate with her own small team. Within 6, she was managing accounts worth more than some companies, presenting to clients who were older than her father would have been, earning the kind of money that would have made the girl eating peanut butter sandwiches on a borrowed couch laugh and cry at the same time. She was 30 years old, and she was good at her life. Not perfect. She had no time for relationships, no time for hobbies, no time for anything that did not connect directly to the forward momentum she had been running at since she was 17. But good, solid, hers. And then she met Daniel. Not the important Daniel. Not the one this story is really about. The other one. The one who would become the reason everything fell apart before everything came back together. Daniel Whitmore was a junior partner at a law firm that had offices 3 floors above Holloway and Reed. He was handsome in the easy, uncomplicated way of men who have never had to work particularly hard for anything. He was funny at dinner parties. He was charming on first dates. He was the kind of man who seemed perfect until you had known him long enough to see that the perfection was a performance, a very practiced, very polished performance, but a performance nonetheless. Callie fell for performance. She is not ashamed of this. She was 30. She was lonely in the way that very driven people are lonely, surrounded by colleagues and achievement and forward movement, but with this deep, quiet ache for something that was not about her career. Daniel felt like the answer to that ache. He felt like the thing she had been too busy to look for. They dated for 14 months. They moved in together after 9. She started rearranging her internal framework, the one that had always put the work first. Always. To include him. She started leaving the office at a reasonable hour. She started having a life outside of the 23rd floor. She was happy. Genuinely, surprisingly, almost suspiciously happy. And then the pink lines appeared. She was not trying to get pregnant. She was not trying. She had been so focused on everything else that the question of children had existed in a vague, someday, not yet category that she had never examined too closely. When she sat on the cold tile floor of her office bathroom at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning in October and looked at those 2 lines, her first emotion was not fear. It was something closer to wonder. A deep, startled, completely overwhelming wonder. She called Daniel that evening. She sat on the edge of their bed with her hands in her lap, and she told him, and she watched his face. What she saw there in the 3 seconds before he composed himself into something more manageable. She never forgot what she saw. It was not joy. It was not fear. It was calculation. A rapid, almost mechanical calculation that passed through his eyes like a ticker tape. He said the right things. He held her hand. He said they would figure it out. He kissed her forehead. He went to get them both a glass of water, and when he came back, he was smiling, and the smile looked right, but something beneath it was wrong in a way she could not name yet. 6 weeks later, he was gone. Not dramatically, not with a fight, just like her father, quietly, in stages, and then completely. He said he was not ready. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped she would understand someday. He packed 2 suitcases and called a car service, and that was the end of Daniel Whitmore. Callie sat in the apartment they had shared, and she let herself feel it for exactly 48 hours. She cried until her face was swollen. She ate cereal for 2 days straight. She called her mother and could not explain why she was crying hard enough that her mother held the phone in silence for 15 minutes. Because sometimes a mother knows that all you need is someone on the other end of the line. On the morning of the third day, she washed her face, put on her best blazer, and went back to work. She told no one. She wore blazers that fell away from her body. She scheduled her prenatal appointments during lunch. She performed at 110% because she was terrified, not of the work, not of the pregnancy, but of what people would do when they found out. She had spent 8 years building her reputation in that building, and she knew with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who has been paying attention, that the moment they knew, something would change. She was right. She was 4 months along when someone saw her coming out of the elevator with a prenatal vitamin bottle sticking out of her bag. She was 4 months along when that someone told someone else. She was 4 months and 3 days along when the HR director, a thin, carefully neutral woman named Margaret, called her into the glass-wall conference room. Margaret was not unkind. Exactly. She was precise. She slid the envelope across the table and explained, in language that had clearly been reviewed by legal counsel, that Callie's position had been eliminated as part of a company restructuring. She said the word restructuring 3 times. She said it with the same tone someone uses when they are reading from a script they do not entirely believe. Callie counted to 11. Then she picked up the envelope, stood up, smoothed her blazer, looked Margaret in the eye, and walked out. She did not cry in the elevator. She did not cry in the lobby. She walked out through the revolving doors onto the sidewalk, and the city moved around her exactly the way it always did, loud and fast and completely indifferent. And she stood there for 1 full minute with her hand resting lightly on her stomach, and she made a decision. She was not going to survive this. She was going to win it. She just did not know yet what winning was going to look like. She went home. She opened her laptop. She called an employment attorney whose name she had gotten from a friend 3 years ago and had hoped she would never need. The attorney, a precise and watchful woman, in her 50s named Sandra, listened to the full story without interrupting. When Callie finished, Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said very calmly that what Callie had just described was a textbook case of pregnancy discrimination under Title VII and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, that the timing was almost egregiously clear, and that Callie should document everything she could remember, dates, conversations, the name of whoever had seen the vitamins, every performance review, every award, every commendation, and bring it all to Sandra's office by the end of the week. Callie spent that night building a document. She was systematic about it the way she was systematic about financial models, methodical, detail-oriented, cross-referenced. By 3 a.m, she had 47 pages. She delivered 63 pages to Sandra's office on Thursday. Sandra read through them, made 2 neat stacks of highlighted notes, looked up at Callie across the desk, and said, "This is one of the cleanest cases I've seen in 18 years. The lawsuit was filed 4 days later. Now, here is where the story shifts. Because while the lawsuit was important, and while what happened with that lawsuit eventually would send shockwaves through an entire industry, the lawsuit is not the center of the story. It is the engine. It is the thing that moved Callie out of the life she had been living and into the collision course she did not see coming. Because while her lawyer was building a case, Callie was building something else. She had savings. 8 years of disciplined, almost aggressive saving because she had never trusted comfort, and she had never forgotten what it felt like to have $14 and no safety net. She had enough to live for a year without income. More, she was careful, and Callie Monroe was always careful. She also had 8 years of relationships, clients who had trusted her, colleagues who had watched her work, a network of people spread across the financial industry who knew what she could do. And she had something that Holloway and Reed had never actually owned, no matter what the termination letter implied. She had her mind. She started consulting from her apartment. Small engagements at first, reviewing reports, sitting in on strategy calls, writing analyses for firms that could not afford a senior partner but needed senior partner level thinking. She charged fairly and delivered exceptionally, and word spread the way good work always does, quietly and quickly and through channels that cannot be manufactured. She was 5 months pregnant when she got her first real client. Not a small engagement. A genuine, sustained contract with a mid-sized private equity firm that had been struggling with their portfolio assessment process for 2 years. She solved their core problem in 6 weeks. They renewed her contract for 6 months. She was 6 months pregnant when she incorporated. She called the company Monroe Advisory Group. She set it up from the second bedroom of her apartment with a laptop, a good chair that she bought used from a medical supply company because her back was starting to ache, and a whiteboard she had dragged home from a closing sale at an office supplies store 3 blocks away. She was 7 months pregnant when she hired her first employee, a young analyst fresh out of NYU, who reminded her so much of herself at 23 that the recognition was almost painful. She was 8 months pregnant when she landed the contract that changed everything. The company was called Voss Infrastructure. It was a privately held infrastructure development firm with projects across 12 states. It was enormous, not publicly known, not the kind of company that showed up in financial news, but enormous in the quiet way of companies that own the pipes and roads and power lines that make everything else possible. It was a kind of company that generated staggering amount of money in almost complete obscurity, because the people who ran it preferred it that way. The man who ran it was named Grant Voss. Callie would not meet him for another 4 months. But his company came to her because someone who knew someone who had watched her work told someone at Voss Infrastructure that if you needed your financial assessment process rebuilt from the ground up without a single weak point, you called Callie Monroe. She took the call in her apartment. She was wearing sweatpants and her back was aching, and she had a half-eaten container of yogurt on the desk next to her laptop. She listened to the brief from the firm's operations director with total focus, asked 12 questions in rapid succession, and said she would have a preliminary proposal by Monday. She delivered it Sunday night. On Monday morning, the operations director called her back and said, "When can you start?" She started 3 weeks later, for days after she came home from the hospital with a 7-pound, 2-ounce baby girl with dark hair and enormous, watchful eyes. She named her daughter Hope. Not because it was on a list, not because she had researched names for months, because on the morning Hope was born, after 21 hours of labor that Callie navigated almost entirely alone. Her mother had driven up from Ohio, but arrived 2 hours after, and in the first moment when they laid that warm, squirming, impossibly alive baby on her chest, Callie felt something she had not felt since before the conference room, before the envelope, before the pink lines in Daniel's calculating eyes, and the 48 hours of cereal. She felt like the future was possible. Hope Monroe, 7 pounds 2 ounces, the most important project Callie had ever taken on. 4 days later, Callie was on a video call with Voss Infrastructure, not because she had to be, not because she was that kind of obsessive, but because the work was there and the work was hers, and she had learned from watching her mother that you do not wait for the world to make room for you. You make room for yourself, and you do it while carrying everything else. She was on that video call with Hope asleep in a bassinet 2 feet away and a burp cloth draped over her left shoulder and a financial model open on her right screen. And she was absolutely sharp, absolutely present, absolutely Callie Monroe. And the operations director on the other end of the call had absolutely no idea that she was doing any of this. She worked the Voss Infrastructure contract for 3 months. She rebuilt their assessment framework from scratch. She found 3 inefficiencies in their acquisition process that were costing them an estimated $40 million annually in missed opportunity cost. She delivered a report that was so thorough and so clear that it was, according to the operations director, immediately passed up the chain, all the way to Grant Voss. She did not know that. She was home with Hope, working during nap times and after 8 in the evening, and during the strange early morning hours when the baby would feed, and then sleep, and Callie would sit in the blue-gray quiet 4 in the morning and work because her mind would not stop, and because the work felt like proof that Daniel had not taken this from her, that Margaret and the glass-walled conference room, and the word restructuring had not taken this from her. She was 6 weeks postpartum when Sandra called with the first update on the lawsuit. Holloway and Reed had received the complaint. They had engaged outside counsel. They had made a preliminary informal, emphatically insulting settlement offer that Sandra relayed with thinly veiled outrage. Callie said no. Sandra said she had hoped she would say that. She was 3 months postpartum when Holloway and Reed made a second offer, substantially larger, with a non-disclosure agreement attached. Callie said no. Sandra said the NDA was telling. She was 4 months postpartum when she got the email. It came from an address she did not recognize, and it was addressed to her directly, not to Monroe Advisory Group, not to her professional contact, to her. The subject line was, "Your Voss Infrastructure Report. Follow-up." The email was 4 sentences. It introduced itself as coming from the personal office of Grant Voss. It said that Mr. Voss had reviewed her report and found it exceptional. It said that Mr. Voss would like to discuss an expanded engagement. It said that Mr. Voss's assistant will be in touch to arrange a meeting at her convenience. Her convenience. Not his schedule, his availability, his preference. Hers. She read it twice. She read it a third time. She sat with Hope in her lap, and she thought about it, and something shifted slightly in the architecture of what she had been building. The way a building shifts when a load-bearing wall turns out to be more capable than the original blueprint suggested. She wrote back 3 hours later. She said she would be available for a meeting. She gave 3 dates. His assistant confirmed the first one within 20 minutes. The meeting was at Voss Infrastructure's New York office, 42nd floor of a building on 6th Avenue. Callie dressed carefully, not to impress, but to communicate. She wore a charcoal blazer and dark trousers, and she left Hope with her mother, who had come up from Ohio for the week, and she took the subway, because she still took the subway, because she was still, in the ways that mattered, the girl from Ohio who did not take taxis she could not justify. She walked into the lobby and gave her name and was taken up by a private elevator that opened directly into a reception area that did not look like a corporate reception area. It looked like someone's very expensive living room. Low lighting, real art on the walls, no fluorescent anything. The assistant who met her was calm and precise, and walked her through to a conference room with a long table and a view of the city that went on forever. She was offered water. She accepted. She sat down and she waited. She waited for 8 minutes. She noted the 8 minutes, not because she was annoyed. She was not, particularly, but because time in these meetings is always a communication, and she wanted to understand what this one was saying. Then the door opened. Grant Voss was not what she expected. She had done her research. Of course she had. She had read every article she could find about him, which were not many because he was genuinely private in a way that most wealthy men in his position were not. Not secretive exactly, not hiding anything, just deeply uninterested in the kind of visibility that other people in his world seemed to need. What she had found was 41 years old, former military, built Voss Infrastructure from a single regional contracting company he had bought at 27 with a loan from a bank that, according to one profile she found, later tried to name a conference room after him when he became significant enough to matter. No spouse, no public relationships, no social media presence of any kind. A reputation for being exceptionally direct, deeply analytical, and almost entirely unreadable. The articles she found included 2 photographs. In both of them, he was looking slightly away from the camera with the particular expression of a man who is tolerating being photographed rather than participating in it. She had formed a general picture from all of this. The picture was a serious, controlled, somewhat austere man who would conduct this meeting efficiently and make a decision at the end of it, and she would either leave with an expanded contract or she would not. The man who walked into that conference room made her picture adjust. He was tall, taller than the photographs had suggested. He wore a dark suit with no tie, and the jacket fit the way jackets fit, when they're made specifically for the person wearing them. He had the kind of face that was, she searched for the word and landed on composed. Not handsome in a magazine way, though he was objectively very good-looking. Composed. Like every feature had been arranged with a purpose. He had dark hair with the first suggestions of gray at the temples and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that she noticed and then immediately stopped noticing because she was a professional and she was here to talk about infrastructure finance. He sat down across from her. He looked at her directly. He did not smile, but his expression was not unfriendly. It was simply present, paying full attention. The kind of full attention that is rare enough that you feel it when it happens, like a pressure shift. He said, "Your report identified $40 million in annual inefficiency." She said, "Conservative estimate." He said, "How conservative?" She said, My model assumes standard market conditions and no operational improvement beyond current benchmarks. If you implement all three recommendations simultaneously and your operations team executes at 80% efficiency, the actual recovery is closer to 65 million annually. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Why did you put 40 in the report?" She said, "Because I only include numbers I can fully defend." Another moment. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the recognition of something. He said, "Tell me about the third recommendation." They talked for 2 hours. Not about pleasantries. Not about backgrounds or getting to know you. Straight into the work. Deep, specific, technical conversation about infrastructure acquisition strategy and risk modeling, and the particular inefficiencies that come from scaling too fast without updating your assessment framework. She had expected him to be sharp. She had not expected him to be this sharp, not book sharp, but operationally sharp, the kind of sharp that comes from having personally managed the consequences of bad decisions for 15 years. He pushed back on 2 of her conclusions with genuine rigor. She held both positions and explained why, and he listened to the explanations and said, "Fair," and moved on. At the end of 2 hours, he looked at his watch, a plain, unadorned watch. She noticed, the kind that tells time without performing about it, and said, "I want to retain Monroe Advisory Group for a full strategic assessment, full access, full scope, 12-month engagement." She said, "I'll need to review what full access means in your context before I commit." He said, "My operations director will send you a scope document this afternoon. If you have questions, you call me directly." He slid a card across the table. White card, black text. Just a number. No title. She looked at the card. She picked it up. She said, "I'll review it tonight and respond by tomorrow morning." He stood. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was. She was not going to think about his grip. She was going home to her daughter. She took the subway home. She sat in the rattling car with the card in her hand and the city moving past the dark windows, and she thought about the meeting with the same analytical precision she brought to everything. He was exceptional at his work. He was precise and rigorous and took her seriously in particular, uncomplicated way that men in his position often do not. The meeting had been one of the best professional conversations she had had in years. Genuinely stimulating, genuinely challenging, genuinely respectful. She was not thinking about his eyes. She was not thinking about the almost smile. She was an independent contractor with a 4-month-old daughter and a lawsuit in progress and a company to run. And she was absolutely not thinking about any of that. She went home. Her mother was in the kitchen. Hope was awake in her bouncer on the kitchen floor, looking up at the overhead light with a rapt, philosophical expression of an infant encountering the concept of illumination for the first time. Callie picked her up and held her against her shoulder and felt the familiar weight and warmth of her and breathed. Her mother looked at her over the stove and said, "How was the meeting?" Callie said, "Good." Her mother said, "Just good." Callie said, "Significant." Her mother looked at her for a moment longer in the particular way of a woman who has known her daughter for 30 years and can read the spaces between words. Then she turned back to the stove and said nothing else. The scope document arrived at 4:17 that afternoon. Callie read it after Hope was down for the evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her laptop. It was thorough, very thorough. Full access meant full access. Financials, operations, acquisition pipeline, management structure. It was a kind of access that companies gave to auditors and accountants and almost never to outside advisory firms, because it required a level of trust that most executives did not extend to people they had met twice. He had met her once. She made 4 notes. She sent them as questions the next morning at 7:45. His response came at 7:52, not from his assistant, from the number on the card. She stared at that for a moment. Then she answered. They went back and forth for 20 minutes by text, which was unusual and somehow more revealing than the meeting had been. His messages were short, direct, and exactly as intelligent as his in-person conversation. No filler, no performance, just clarity. By 8:15, they had resolved all 4 questions. By 8:45, she had sent her formal acceptance. The 12-month engagement began the following Monday. For the first 2 months, She worked primarily with his operations team. She was rarely in the same room as Grant Voss. He was in Chicago for 3 weeks, then in Houston, then traveling to 3 different project sites in the Southwest. She received occasional messages from his number, questions about specific elements of her progress reports, a note pointing out a data set she might want to cross-reference. Once a single line that said only, "The operations director mentioned you found a problem in the Colorado acquisition. I'd like to hear your analysis when you're ready." She sent him a 12-page memo. He responded, "When you have time, let's talk." They talked for 90 minutes, over the phone this time, and it was somehow less guarded than the in-person meeting had been. She was not sure why. He was quieter on the phone, more considered, like he was choosing each word with slightly more care than he did face-to-face. She was back home at her kitchen table. Hope was asleep. It was 9 in the evening. They were talking about the structural flaws in a $30 million acquisition, and she was also peripherally aware of a quality in his voice that she was cataloging and then deliberately uncataloguing. She was a professional. She was also a woman who had made exactly one significant personal error in the past 3 years, and she was not in the market for additional ones. Month 3 of the engagement. He was in New York for an extended period, and she was at the Voss offices several days a week. They began having brief end-of-day check-ins. 15 minutes, sometimes 20, going through whatever she had been working on. His assistant scheduled them. They were professional, efficient, except that they also, with increasing frequency, ran over, not by a lot, 10 minutes, sometimes 15, because the conversation would move from the specific thing she was reporting on to a related question he had thought of to a broader strategic issue. And it was simply easy, unusually easy, the kind of easy that happens rarely enough that you notice it without wanting to. She noticed it. She also noticed that she was noticing it, and she filed that away under things she was not acting on. His assistant was named Patrick, and Patrick was in his 50s and had worked for Grant Voss for 11 years and had, Callie sensed, seen quite a lot in that time. Patrick was warm and funny in a dry, sidelong way, and he started calling Callie by her first name sometime in the 3rd week. He also started, subtly, arranging things in ways that she did not specifically request. A better conference room for her team, an updated access badge that worked in the executive elevator, a standing coffee order that appeared on her desk every morning without discussion. She did not ask who had arranged that. In month 4, she found something. She was deep in Voss Infrastructure's acquisition files, specifically the records of a pipeline acquisition in Louisiana from 4 years ago, and she found an inconsistency, not a small one, a significant, recurring, deliberate-looking inconsistency in the environmental compliance documentation, the kind that did not happen by accident, the kind that had to be managed, maintained, hidden. She sat with it for 2 days. She cross-referenced it against 3 other acquisitions from the same period. The pattern held. Someone inside Voss Infrastructure, someone with access, someone who'd been there 4 years ago and potentially still was, had been systematically misrepresenting environmental data on multiple acquisitions. This was not a financial inefficiency. This was potential liability on a scale that could, if it reached the wrong people, threaten the entire company. She called the number on the white card. He answered on the 2nd ring, which was always how he answered. She had noticed. Not immediate, never sent a voicemail, always the 2nd ring. She said she needed to see him, in person, that day if possible. There was a pause. Not long. Then he said, "My office." 1 hour. She was there in 45 minutes because she was not, at this particular moment, thinking about optics. She was thinking about what she had found and what it meant and what he needed to know. He was at his desk when she came in, a large, spare desk with 2 monitors and very little else. He stood when she entered, which she had noticed he always did, not performatively, but reflexively, the kind of automatic courtesy that becomes a habit so deeply embedded you no longer think about it. He gestured to the sitting area at the other end of the office, 2 chairs and a low table, and they sat. She put her laptop on the table and walked him through it. She was methodical and clear, and she did not soften anything because there was no time or reason to soften it. She showed him the Louisiana file. She showed him the pattern. She showed him the 3 other acquisitions. He listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise and relevant, and she answered all 3. Then he sat back in his chair, and there was a long silence. His face had not changed exactly. It was still composed, still controlled. But something had shifted behind it, something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, and was something more complicated than either. He said, "How many people have access to this?" She said, "Currently, just me." He said, "You didn't tell the operations team." She said, "I wanted to talk to you first." Another silence. He looked at the screen. He looked at her. He said, "Why?" She thought about it for one honest second and said, "Because whoever did this had access. I don't know yet if they still do, and I don't know who knew." He held her gaze. Then he said, "Send me everything you have. Don't put it on the company server. Send it to this address." He wrote an address on a notepad and tore off the page and slid it across the table. She took it. She stood up. She reached for her laptop, and he said, without looking up from the page where he was writing something, "Thank you for bringing this to me." She said, "It's my job." He looked up. He said, "No, your job was to find financial inefficiencies. This is more than that." She did not answer. She picked up her laptop and left. She sent everything to the private address from her apartment that evening. Hope was in her bouncer on the living room floor, and Callie was at the coffee table, and the city was doing its nighttime thing outside the window, and she was thinking about the 4-year-old Louisiana file, and the pattern that could not have been accidental, and the expression on his face when she had walked him through it. Not the composed face. The other one, the one underneath. She ate dinner. She fed Hope. She put Hope to bed. She went to sleep at 11 and dreamed about nothing she could remember. At 2:17 in the morning, her phone lit up, a text from the number on the card. It said, "I know who it is." She stared at the ceiling for a long time after that. She responded, "Are you going to tell me?" He responded, in the morning, "Thank you for tonight." She put the phone down. She lay in the dark, and she thought about the fact that the most powerful man in her professional life had just sent her a text at 2 in the morning that ended with "Thank you for tonight," and she was going to be mature and professional about that. She was absolutely going to be professional about it. She was also just slightly not sleeping. In the morning, he was at the office before her, and when she came in, Patrick directed her straight to the conference room where Grant Voss was already sitting with his general counsel and a man she did not recognize. He introduced her as the advisor who had discovered the issue. The man she did not recognize was introduced as former federal prosecutor, now turned outside legal counsel. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, Callie understood the full picture. The person responsible was a senior acquisition manager who had been with the company for 6 years, who had been falsifying environmental documentation to speed up approval timelines on acquisitions he personally had authority over, who had been receiving payments from an outside contractor with an interest in those projects moving quickly. He was not small-time. He was trusted. He was well-liked. He had attended the company holiday party every year. He had a framed photo of his kids on his desk. He was also, as of that morning, the subject of an internal investigation and on his way to becoming the subject of a federal one. Grant Voss did not look at Callie throughout most of that meeting, but at the very end, as people were gathering their things and the general counsel was already on the phone, he caught her eye from across the table. He said nothing, but the look he gave her was, she could not fully categorize it. It was not gratitude, though it contained that. It was not the professional acknowledgement she had been expecting. It was something more personal than either of those things. Something that recognized her in a way that went beyond the work. She looked back at him for exactly as long as felt honest. Then she picked up her notebook and left the room. The following weeks were intense. There were lawyer meetings and document reviews in the quiet, but sweeping internal restructuring that happens when a company has discovered it has a wound and needs to determine how deep it goes. Callie was involved in all of it, not as a peripheral figure, but as the person who had found the thread and understood the fabric. She was in the office almost every day. She worked late. Patrick started leaving food on her desk in the evenings, not ordering it in, but actual food in real containers. And when she asked him about it, he said only that the building had a kitchen and someone might as well use it. She was in the conference room at 8 in the evening one Thursday, alone with her laptop and the remnants of whatever Patrick had left for her, when Grant Voss came in. He was still in his suit jacket, but he had loosened his tie, the only concession to informality she had ever seen him make, and he had a file in his hand, but he set it on the table without opening it and sat down across from her. He said, "How are you doing with all of this?" She looked up. She said, "I'm fine. I'm in the middle of the compliance cross-reference. I think I'll have the preliminary findings by Monday." He said, "That's not what I asked." She stopped. She looked at him properly. He was looking back at her with a particular expression she had started to recognize, the present one, the fully paying attention one, and he was not asking about the work. She said, "I'm fine. I find this kind of problem more interesting than it is stressful." He said, "You were building this from your apartment, with a newborn." She said, "People do more with less." He said, "I know. I'm not suggesting otherwise." A pause. "I'm trying to ask how you actually are, and I seem to be bad at it." She looked at him. Something softened involuntarily in her chest, and she put it back where it came from and said, "I'm good. Genuinely. The work is meaningful. My daughter is healthy. My lawsuit is progressing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your lawsuit?" She said, "Against my former employer, for pregnancy discrimination." He said, "You were fired for being pregnant." She said, "My position was eliminated," with exactly the inflection she had given to that phrase since the day Margaret said it to her. His jaw tightened, a small, brief movement, but she caught it. He said, "When?" She said, "About a year ago now." He said, "While you were building Monroe Advisory Group." She said, "After I was building Monroe Advisory Group. The lawsuit came first, then the company." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Most people would have settled." She said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you?" She thought about this. She said, "Because settling means signing a paper that says it didn't happen. And it happened. And I'm not signing a paper." He was quiet again. The city was doing its thing outside the windows. The office was mostly empty, just the low hum of the building. He said, "My mother worked 3 jobs for 7 years to keep us in our house after my father was injured. She was passed over for a promotion at one of them. She found out later it was because she had asked for a schedule adjustment to be home when we got off the school bus. She never made a formal complaint. She just moved on." A pause. "I was 16 when that happened. I didn't know enough yet to be as angry as I should have been." She watched him. This was more than he had said about himself in any conversation she could recall, and it had the quality of something that did not come out often, like an object kept in a drawer and rarely examined. She said softly, "How old are you now when you think about it?" He looked at her. Something moved through his face. He said 16. Still. They sat in the quiet for a moment. Just that. The comfortable, slightly weighted quiet of 2 people who were beginning to understand each other. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at it. The moment changed, not broke, just shifted, and he stood and said, "You should go home. Patrick has already left for the night." She said, "I'm aware of that." He said, "Do you need a car?" She said, "I take the subway." He said, "I know. I'm asking anyway." She looked at him. She said, "I'm fine, Grant." It was the first time she had used his name. Not Mr. Voss, not a formal address. Just his name. The way you use someone's name when they have moved from one category to another in your mind, and you have not quite decided what to do about it yet. He did not respond immediately. Then he said, "Good night, Callie." She took the subway home. She picked up Hope from the sitter 2 blocks away and carried her daughter home through the autumn evening. And Hope looked up at the streetlights with those enormous watching eyes, and Callie thought about a 16-year-old boy watching his mother be quietly, undramatically wronged, and not yet knowing what to do with the anger. She thought about it for a long time after Hope was asleep. The next development in the lawsuit came at the worst possible time, which is typically when developments come. Sandra called on a Friday morning. She said Holloway and Reed had changed their legal team. The new firm was Grayson and Porter, one of the most aggressive employment defense firms in the city. Sandra said this was not unexpected, but it meant the timeline would extend and the depositions would be more combative than she had initially anticipated. Callie asked what that meant practically. Sandra said it meant they were going to try to make her life uncomfortable enough that she reconsidered settling. Callie said, "Let them." Sandra said, "I need you to be prepared. They're going to go through everything. Your personal life, your professional decisions, your performance reviews, your relationships, everything." Callie said she understood. Sandra said there was one more thing. She said Grayson and Porter had already reached out to someone who used to work at Holloway and Reed and who, it seemed, was willing to characterize Callie's performance in the final weeks before her termination in ways that were not favorable. Callie said, "Who?" Sandra said, "A former colleague, Karen Ellison." Callie said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Karen Ellison told me 2 days before my termination that she thought what was happening to me was wrong." Sandra said, "I know. I believe you. That's not going to matter to Grayson and Porter." Callie said, "Get her on record saying it was wrong." Sandra said, "That's going to be difficult." Callie said, "I know." She hung up. She sat in her apartment kitchen with Hope and the bouncer, and the morning coming through the window, and the specific, cold-edged feeling of realizing that someone she had trusted was going to be used against her. She had experienced this before. The first time was with her father. The second was with Daniel. You would think it would get easier to absorb. It does not. She let herself feel it for 1 hour. Then she opened her laptop and went back to work. 2 weeks after that, she was at the Voss offices, and she was in the middle of a complex cross-referencing task when Patrick knocked on the conference room door and said that she had a call she might want to take. He said it with a particular expression, not alarmed exactly, but careful, and handed her a sticky note with a number on it. She called it, the woman on the other, and introduced herself as a journalist. She worked for a financial news outlet, a legitimate, respectable one. She said she had been covering Holloway and Reed for 3 months and had become aware, through sources she could not name, of a pattern of terminations at the firm that seemed connected to a common thread. She said Callie Monroe's name had come up in the context of that pattern. She said she was not trying to cause problems. She was trying to understand what was happening, and she would like to speak with Callie on background. Callie said, "I have an active lawsuit. I can't comment on specifics." The journalist said, "I understand. I'm not asking about the specifics. I'm asking whether you would characterize your experience as part of a pattern." Callie thought about this. She said, "Tell me what you know first." The journalist told her. There were 4 other women, she said, all senior level, all terminated within a 12-month period, 2 with newborns, 1 who had just returned from maternity leave, 1 who had requested a scheduled accommodation for a pregnancy-related medical appointment. Callie sat very still. She said, "Are any of them in litigation?" The journalist said 2 of them were. She mentioned Sandra's name. Callie said, "I'll speak with my attorney. If she agrees, I'll call you back." She called Sandra. Sandra already knew about the journalist. She said the 2 other cases had been filed separately and that there was emerging discussion about whether consolidating the cases might be advantageous. She said the pattern, if documented publicly, could significantly change the legal pressure on Holloway and Reed. She said it could also significantly increase the personal pressure on Callie. Callie said, "I know." Sandra said, "You don't have to be the person who does this." Callie said, "For other women, how many more of that didn't get lawyers?" Sandra was quiet. Callie said, "Tell me what you need from me." That is the moment the story became something larger than itself. That is the moment Callie Monroe went from a woman fighting for herself to something more complicated and more consequential. She did not do it for attention. She did not do it for settlement leverage, though Sandra acknowledged that the publicity would likely accelerate a resolution. She did it because of her mother, who never made a formal complaint and just moved on. She did it because of the women who had also moved on and were not going to get what they deserved in silence. She did it because she'd been paying attention her whole life to the way things work, and she had learned that systems only change when people are willing to put their name on the record and say, "This is what happened." She put her name on the record. The article ran on a Thursday. It was careful, specific, and devastating. It named the pattern. It cited 4 cases. It quoted Callie by name, not on the specific fact of her litigation, but on her experience of what it had meant to be fired 4 months into her pregnancy after 8 years of exceptional performance. Her quote was one sentence: "They took my work history and made it mean nothing the moment I became inconvenient. I'm here to prove that that doesn't get to be the end of the story." By Friday afternoon, the story had been picked up by 3 major outlets. By Saturday morning, it was trending. By Monday, Holloway and Reed stock had dropped 4% on what the market was calling reputational risk. By Tuesday, Grayson and Porter had called Sandra to discuss a revised settlement framework. Sandra called Callie. She said it was a significant offer. She said it included a public acknowledgement, not an admission, but an acknowledgement and individual settlements for all 5 women. She said the NDA provisions had been significantly reduced. Callie said, "I want full terms in writing by end of week, and I want 48 hours to review them." Sandra said, "Of course." She hung up. She was at the Voss offices, in the small conference room she had started to think of as hers, and she sat for a moment in the strange ringing silence of a thing that had been in motion for a year and might be coming to rest. There was a knock at the door. Grant Voss came in without waiting, which he had started doing recently, and which he had stopped noting as unusual. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which was new, and he set one in front of her and sat down. He said, "I saw the article." She said, "When?" He said, "Thursday night." She said, "And?" He said, "I called Patrick and told him to make sure you had everything you needed from us in terms of scheduling flexibility for the next few weeks." She looked at him. She said, "You could have just told me that." He said, "I wanted to tell you separately." A pause. "The article was... I thought it was incredibly brave, what you said." She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "I thought it was necessary." He said, "Both can be true." He paused. "You've been carrying this the whole time we've been working together." She said, "I carry a lot of things simultaneously. It's a skill." He looked at her with something that was very close to the expression he had had in the office that night. The personal one, the underneath one. He said, "I know. I've been watching you work for 5 months. I'm aware of what you carry." The room was quiet. She was aware of a very specific kind of awareness, the kind that sits in your peripheral vision and moves to the center when you're not careful. She said, "The settlement discussion may be moving forward." He said, "Good." She said, "It means I'll have more time to focus on the full scope assessment. I've been slightly divided." He said, "You haven't seemed divided." She said, "That's because I'm good at not seeming things." He held her gaze. He said very quietly, "I know." He left shortly after. She sat with her coffee and looked at the city outside the window and had a very direct, very clear-eyed conversation with herself about what was happening and what she was going to do about it. What was happening? The most important client of her professional life, who was also a man of significant power and exceptional intelligence and a very specific kind of personal integrity that she had not expected to find and found deeply compelling, was paying attention to her in a way that had moved past professional, had been moving past professional for some time. What she was going to do about it? Nothing, because she was a professional, because her company was young, because she had a 4-month-old daughter and a lawsuit in progress, and because she had learned the expensive way. What happened when she let the personal and the professional become entangled? She finished her coffee. She opened her laptop. She worked for 3 more hours, and then she went home to Hope. She maintained this position for another 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, the settlement negotiations with Holloway and Reed moved forward and then stalled and then moved again. The Voss compliance investigation was resolved. The acquisition manager was quietly removed. The outside contractor severed. The documents flagged for remediation. Federal counsel involved at a level that had been managed with extraordinary discretion. Callie's 12-month engagement continued. She expanded her team by 2 more analysts, which meant she was now running a 6-person operation out of what was no longer just her apartment. She had, 2 months earlier, quietly leased a small office space in Midtown that had 1 good conference room, and a second room she had turned into a server room, and a third that her team had collectively and without discussion turned into a kitchen. Monroe Advisory Group was real, not just real, growing. She had 3 concurrent client engagements outside of Voss, and 2 more in discussion. She had been approached by a recruiting firm about a senior role at a competitor of her old employer, and the particular pleasure of being headhunted by a firm that was trying to poach her away from herself had been deeply satisfying even as she declined it. She was also, by any objective measure, exhausted in the specific way of single mothers who are building companies. She was sleeping 5.5 hours on good nights. She had a standing order at the coffee shop on the corner that the people there started preparing when they saw her coming through the door. Her mother called every Sunday, and Callie answered every Sunday, and they talk about hope and about Ohio and about things that had nothing to do with any of this. And those calls were the part of the week that felt most like air. She was in this state, competent and tired and carefully maintained and doing exactly what needed to be done, when a thing happened that she had not been prepared for. It was a Tuesday evening. She had been at the Voss offices late, and she was in the private elevator, going down to the lobby, when the elevator stopped at the 39th floor, and Grant Voss got on. He was carrying his jacket over one arm, and he looked like she felt, not undone exactly, but slightly less composed than usual. The way a person looks at the end of the day that is asked more than expected. They stood side by side. The elevator moved. The city was far below. He said, "You look tired." She said, "I am tired." He said, "When did you last have a day off?" She thought about it genuinely. She said, "Last Tuesday. Hope had a cold, and I work from home, which almost counts." He said, "That doesn't count." She said, "I know." The elevator arrived at the lobby. They walked out together. At the revolving door, he stopped. She stopped. He said, "Have you eaten dinner?" She said, "I'm going to get something at home." He said, "There's a restaurant 2 blocks from here. I was going to eat before going back to the office. Come eat." She looked at him. She said, "That sounds like asking me to dinner." He said, "It is asking you to dinner." The quiet between them was about 4 seconds long and contained about 4 months' worth of things that had not been said. She said, "I have to be home by 9. The sitter has a 10 o'clock. He said, "I know where you live. I can have you home by 9. She looked at him. She said, "You know where I live?" He said, with the almost smile, "I have a driver. He's been taking you home on the nights you work late for 2 months. You think it's a coincidence that the car is always there when you come out." She stared at him. He said, "You take the subway to come to the office. You let the driver take you home after late nights because you have a daughter waiting." It seemed sensible to make that consistent. She said, "You've been sending me a car for 2 months, and you didn't mention it." He said, "You would have declined if I had mentioned it." She said, "That is absolutely correct." He said, "Are you going to decline dinner?" She was looking at him, and she was thinking about the car and the coffee and the food Patrick left on her desk and the way he had called her to check on her after the article and the 217 message and the look in the conference room. And she was thinking about her very clear and professionally sound decision to do nothing about any of this. And she was also thinking about the fact that she was 31 years old and genuinely exhausted and genuinely lonely in the underneath way, and that this particular man had just asked her to dinner with such complete lack of pretense that she did not have a sophisticated defense against it. She said, "I'm not declining dinner." They walked 2 blocks to a restaurant that was quiet and good, and clearly somewhere he went often because the host knew him without looking at any list, and took them to a table in the back that was slightly apart from the others. There was no menu ceremony. He ordered wine that he asked her if she wanted first. They were given bread that she ate with the frank enthusiasm of someone who's been working for 4 hours without food and has stopped pretending otherwise. They did not talk about work. This was unexpected. She had assumed they would. It was their native language. But he asked about hope, and she told him about hope, and she talked for 15 minutes about her daughter with a fullness she had not allowed herself in a professional context before, and he listened with the same quality of attention he brought to financial analysis, which was complete and unhurried and genuine. He told her about his brother. Younger brother, in Denver, 2 kids, worked in construction, called every Sunday. The kind of relationship, he said, that had been difficult when they were younger and easier now because they had both gotten old enough to stop expecting the other person to be someone different. She said, "Are you close?" He said, "Closer than we were." It took some work. She said, "What kind of work?" He said, The kind where you go see someone you've avoided, and you sit in their kitchen for a weekend, and you eat bad pizza, and you talk about things you've both been not saying for 15 years. A pause. It turns out the things you've been not saying are usually the things you should have said first. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I've been not saying things my whole life." He said, "I know." She looked at him. She said, "You say that a lot." He said, "You're very legible to me, more than I expected." She said, "Most people would say I'm not." He said, "Most people aren't paying attention." The food came. They ate. The restaurant was warm and the wine was good, and the city was outside doing its relentless thing, and they were in a back corner of a quiet place, and something was happening with remarkable simplicity, as if it had been going to happen all along, and they were merely catching up to it. She told him about Daniel, not with bitterness. She had moved past bitterness into something more like clear-eyed understanding, but honestly, she told him about the calculation she had seen in Daniel's face. She told him about the 48 hours of cereal. She told him about her mother on the phone saying nothing, and that being exactly right. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "What was he like before all of that?" She thought. She said, "Charming, easy, very good in company. I think I loved who I thought he was more than I actually knew him, which is not a defense. That's just true." He said, "It's generous of you to separate those things." She said, "It's useful. Being bitter doesn't give me my 8 months back. Being accurate does." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "How did you decide to keep her?" The question was direct enough to be startling. She did not recoil from it. She said, "It wasn't a decision in the way people mean when they say decision. It was more like, when I saw those 2 lines, I just knew, not that it would be easy. I knew it would be extraordinarily hard, but I knew she was mine, and I was keeping her." He said, "Were you scared?" She said, "I'm still scared. Every day. I'm scared I'm doing it wrong. I'm scared she's not sleeping enough. I'm scared she's sleeping too much. I'm scared that she's going to grow up and ask me why she doesn't have a father, and I don't know what to say that is both honest and kind." A pause. "I'm less scared of all the other stuff. The work, the company, the lawsuit, that stuff I can control. She's the one thing I can't control, and she's the most important thing." He was quiet. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, not the professional one, not the almost smile, not the underneath one. Something that was quieter than all of those and went deeper. He said, "She's lucky to have you." She said, "I know that's what people say." He said, "I mean it specifically, not as a courtesy. I've watched you carry all of this with a quality of grace that I don't think you give yourself credit for." She held his gaze. She said, "Don't." He said, "Don't what?" She said, "Don't say things like that to me if you don't mean them with your whole self. I don't have room for partial things." He did not look away. He said, "I'm aware of that. I wouldn't have said it otherwise." The restaurant was warm. The city was outside. They ate and they talked, and at 8:45, she said she needed to go home, and he had the car there by the time they reached the door. At the car, she stopped. She looked at him. She said, "This was good." He said, "It was." She said, "I'm going to continue being a professional." He said, with a smile, not the almost smile, the real one, which she had not seen before and which was, she registered with clear-eyed honesty, "Very good. I know. So am I." She got in the car. The driver took her home. She paid the sitter, checked on Hope, and stood in the doorway of her daughter's room watching her sleep with the absolute, unguarded softness on her face that she only allowed herself when no one else was watching. She was not going to fall in love with him. That was not a viable situation. It would compromise the engagement, complicate the company, risk everything she was building. He was a client, the most important client. Falling in love with him would be professionally catastrophic. She went to bed. She lay in the dark, thinking about the real smile. She was in significant trouble. The weeks that followed had a particular quality, the quality of 2 people who are being very careful and not being careful at all simultaneously. The work continued. The check-ins continued. They had dinner twice more, and on both occasions they maintained an easy, mutual understanding that they were not calling it anything yet. They were just two people who were honest with each other in ways that were uncommon, and neither of them were pretending otherwise. Hope turned 6 months old. Callie took her to the park on a Saturday and sat on a bench in the October light and watched her daughter examine a fallen leaf with the absolute, consuming focus of a person encountering leaves for the first time, and she felt so full she almost could not contain it. She texted Grant a photo, not professionally, just the photo of Hope with the leaf. She sent it before she thought about sending it, which told her more about the state of things than any analysis she could have run. He responded 20 minutes later with a single line, "She has your eyes." She stared at her phone. Hope dropped the leaf and looked up at her mother. Callie laughed, and it was a laugh that came from the middle of something real. The settlement with Holloway and Reed was finalized on a Thursday in November. Sandra called at 10 in the morning and read her the terms. It was not everything. No settlement ever is. But it was substantial. It was a public acknowledgement that the terminations had occurred in a discriminatory pattern. It was individual payments to all 5 women. It was a stated commitment to third-party monitoring of HR practices for 3 years. And it did not require any of the 5 women to say it did not happen. Callie sat at her kitchen table, and she called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring. Callie said, "Mom, it's over. We won." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew it." Callie said, "You always know everything." Her mother said, "I didn't know everything. I knew you." Callie put her hand over her mouth. She sat in her kitchen in a November morning with Hope and the bouncer and the city outside, and she let herself cry for exactly as long as she needed to, which was 4 minutes, which was enough. She called Sandra and said thank you in a way that she meant completely. She sent flowers to the other 4 women. She wrote them each a note by hand. That evening she went to the Voss offices for a meeting. It was a short one, end-of-week review, not a long session. Afterward, Grant appeared in the doorway of the conference room, and she told him the settlement had been finalized. She said it simply as information. He crossed the room without ceremony, and she had not expected this. He put his arms around her, not romantically, not with any agenda, just held her, the way you hold someone when something they've been carrying for a long time has finally been set down. She stood in that office with her cheek against the shoulder of his jacket, and she breathed for a moment without holding anything. He said quietly, "You did that." She said, into his shoulder, "We all did it." He said, "You did it." She stepped back. She looked at him. She said, "Thank you for car, and the coffee, and the food Patrick kept leaving." He said, "You knew about the food." She said, "Patrick is very transparent when he likes someone." He said, "He likes everyone." She said, "He likes you too. He's proud of you, and he doesn't know how to say it, so he leaves food on people's desks." Grant looked at her for a moment with something that she had come to understand was the closest he got to being caught off guard. He said, "You're going to make this very difficult to maintain professionally, aren't you?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." She went home. She picked up Hope and held her and danced in the kitchen to a song playing on the radio, a slow, comfortable song, and her daughter was warm against her chest, and the kitchen light was warm, and she was, in the specific and quiet and hard-won way of someone who has clawed everything good from difficult ground, happy. She was happy, which meant, naturally, that something was about to happen. It happened 2 weeks later. She was at her own office, Monroe Advisory Group's small midtown space, and she was on a call with a potential new client when her assistant knocked and said there was someone in the lobby who did not have an appointment but had asked specifically for her. She muted the call. She asked who it was. Her assistant said a woman named Margaret Holloway. She said she was from Holloway and Reed. Callie's first thought was, which Holloway? Because the firm was named for 2 founding partners, and she had never actually met either of them. Margaret, the HR director, had a different last name. She finished her call, cleanly, professionally, even as her heart rate had done something inconvenient, and she told her assistant to bring the woman in. Margaret Holloway was in her 60s, white-haired, with a particular bearing of a woman who had been powerful for so long she no longer thought about it. She was not what Callie had expected. She sat down across from Callie's desk, and she looked at Callie with an expression that was hard to read. Not hostile, not apologetic, something more complicated than either. She said, "You don't know who I am." Callie said, "I know the name." Margaret Holloway said, "I am the founder's wife. My husband built that firm for 40 years. I stepped back from active management 15 years ago." A pause. "I read about the settlement. I wanted to speak with you." Callie said nothing. She waited. Margaret said, "I want you to know that what happened to you and to those other women was not sanctioned. Not by my husband, not by me. It was a result of a management culture that developed after we stepped back, and that neither of us fully understood until the settlement made it visible." She paused. "That is not an excuse. I am not here to make excuses. I am here to say that I have read your file, your full file, 8 years of performance reviews, and what they did to you was wrong, straightforwardly wrong." Callie was quiet for a moment. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret said, "Because you deserve to hear it from someone with a name on the door." A pause. "And because I want to ask what you're building. Your company. I've heard about it." Callie said, "I'm building an independent advisory firm." Margaret said, "I know. I've spoken to 2 of your clients." She looked at her hands for a moment. "My husband is stepping back fully next year. The firm will go through significant changes. We are looking at bringing in new leadership, not from the old structure." She looked back at Callie. "I wanted to see who you were before I made any further inquiries." Callie said, "What kind of inquiries?" Margaret said, "The kind that involve substantial conversations about the future." She stood. She was leaving, it seemed, having said what she came to say. At the door she turned. She said, "For what it's worth, the HR director, Margaret, the other one, she resigned the week after the settlement was announced. She left a note for the record that said she had been given instructions she should have refused." She paused. "I thought you might want to know that." She left. Callie sat in her office for a long time after that. She was thinking about 8 years of performance reviews. She was thinking about a management culture developing in the dark while the founders were away. She was thinking about a woman who resigned and left a note for the record. She was also thinking about what kind of inquiries meant. She called Sandra and told her about the visit. Sandra was professionally unsurprised and personally fascinated. She said to document the conversation and wait. She said not to be surprised if something came of it. Something came of it, but not in the way she expected. 2 days later, she was at the Voss offices for a quarterly review meeting. It was a full morning session. Her team, the operations team, the CFO, Grant. She presented. The presentation was good. She knew it was good because she had built it herself over 3 nights, and it synthesized 9 months of work into a clear, defensible strategic picture that identified 5 significant opportunities and 2 material risks in Voss Infrastructure's current trajectory. Grant did not interrupt during the presentation. He rarely did. He listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with a specificity that told her he had been tracking every detail, "The second risk, the regulatory exposure in the Midwest pipeline cluster. You're rating it medium-high. I'd push it to high." She said, "Walk me through your reasoning." He did. She adjusted the rating. The meeting continued. Afterward, when the room had cleared and her team had gone ahead and she was packing her materials, he said, without preamble, "Someone called my office about you." She looked up. He said, "Margaret Holloway, not the HR director, the founder's wife." Callie went very still. He said, "She wanted to know my opinion of your work." Callie said, "What did you tell her?" He said, "I told her you were the most capable advisor I had ever engaged. I told her that finding the environmental compliance issue alone was worth more than the full contract fee. I told her that if she was considering any kind of engagement with Monroe Advisory Group, she should consider it the best professional decision she could make." He paused. "And then I asked her why she was asking." Callie said, "What did she say?" He said, "She said she was considering proposing a significant operational restructuring and needed an outside firm to lead the assessment. She said she had heard your name in multiple contexts and wanted to verify the reputation." Callie looked at him. She said, She came to see me. He said, I know. She told me that too. She sat down. She said, this is very strange. He said, is it? She said, the firm that fired me is potentially going to become a client. He said, life tends to do that. Complete strange circles. She said, that could be significant for Monroe Advisory Group. He said, it could. She said, it could also be complicated. He said, why? She said, because you called them and vouched for me. He said, I told the truth about you. She said, it still complicates things. He said, how? She looked at him. She said, because you're not just a client, Grant. You haven't been just a client for some time. And if I bring in a client based on your referral, the professional independence I've been very careful about maintaining starts to look different. He was quiet. He was looking at her with the full attention. He said, is that the only reason you're worried about the independence? She said, no. He said, what's the other reason? She said, you know what the other reason is. He said, I want you to say it. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, because in about 6 weeks, this engagement ends. And when it ends, you stop being my client. And when you stop being my client, we will both have to decide what we do about the fact that I've been trying very hard not to fall in love with you, and it has not been particularly working. The office was very quiet. The city was outside doing its thing. He said, 6 weeks. She said, you could count differently. He said, I could. He was still. I've been counting differently since November. She said, that's too fast. He said, I know. She said, I have a daughter. He said, I know. She said, my company is 9 months old. He said, I know. She said, if this goes wrong, it has consequences for my professional life that a different kind of personal mistake wouldn't have. He said, I know all of that, Callie. I've been knowing all of that while watching you build something extraordinary for 9 months. She looked at him. She said, and? He said, and I'm not asking you to do anything about it tonight. I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm asking you to acknowledge that in 6 weeks we have a conversation. That's all. Just a conversation. She said, just a conversation. He said, yes. She said, and if that conversation goes somewhere, he said, we figure it out. Together. Carefully. She sat with it. She looked at her hands on the conference table. She looked at the city. She looked at him. She said, okay. He said, okay. That was unexpectedly enough. The 6 weeks moved the way time moves when you are watching it. Slower than usual and with more texture. She noticed things she had been allowing herself to not notice. The way he remembered the specific details of things she had mentioned once. The way he talked to her team, not past them, not through them, directly to them by name, with genuine interest. The way he was with Patrick. Not imperious, not performative, just consistently and quietly decent in a way that cost him nothing, because it was just how he was. She noticed that he did not talk about himself except in response to questions. She noticed that when he was thinking hard about something, his jaw shifted slightly to the left. She noticed that he had a small, barely visible scar along his jawline that she had never directly asked about, and that she was storing in the same part of her attention where she was storing everything else she was not supposed to be accumulating. She also, during these 6 weeks, did 2 things that changed the shape of the future. The first was a meeting with Margaret Holloway, not in her office, not in Holloway and Reed's offices, at a restaurant in Midtown Neutral Ground. Margaret laid out what she was proposing, a full restructuring assessment, internal culture audit, and management framework rebuild for Holloway and Reed over 18 months. It was the largest engagement Callie had ever been offered. It was also the most loaded with history. She asked for a week to think. She spent that week doing what she always did with a difficult problem. She made a document. She wrote down the risks on the left side and the opportunities on the right. She wrote down the things she could control and the things she could not. She wrote down what it would mean for the 4 other women if the firm that had discriminated against them was rebuilt by one of them. That last item sat on the right side of the page and would not stop being large. She called Sandra. Sandra said, with the voice of someone who had been in this industry long enough to have seen everything, you know what this is? This is what winning actually looks like, not the settlement. She accepted the engagement. The second thing she did was call Hope's pediatrician because Hope had been slightly congested for a week, and then the pediatrician said it was normal and she should not worry. And Callie took a breath and thought, I am doing this. I am raising a person and building a company and navigating the most emotionally complex year of my life, and my daughter is fine, and I am fine, and this is all going to be all right. She texted Grant that night. She said, accepted the Holloway engagement. He wrote back, good. You're going to change that place. She wrote back, that's the plan. He wrote back, for weeks. She wrote back, for weeks. She put her phone down and smiled at her ceiling and went to sleep. The final 4 weeks of the Voss engagement were, professionally, some of the best work of her career. She delivered the full 12-month assessment in a document that was comprehensive enough that Grant CFO said it was the most thorough strategic review the company had ever undergone. She presented the final report in a full session with the senior leadership team and answered every question cleanly and left the room with the satisfaction of knowing she had done exactly what she had promised to do. On the last official day of the engagement, Patrick appeared in the conference room doorway with a bottle of very good champagne and 2 glasses and the expression of a man who has been waiting to do this for some time. She looked at him and said, "Did he send you?" Patrick said, "He asked me to." He paused. "For what it's worth, I think you're remarkable. I've worked for Mr. Voss for 11 years, and I've seen a lot of advisors come through this office, and you are something different." She said, "Patrick." He said, "Don't make a big thing of it." She said, "Thank you." He left the champagne and 2 glasses and left. She poured 1 glass. She was sitting with it when Grant came in, and she poured the second one, and they touched glasses, and he said, "You built something real." She said, "I know." He said, "So did I?" She looked at him. He said, "The engagement is over." She said, "Yes." He said, "So?" She said, "So?" He said, "I'd like to take you to dinner. Not as a client, not as a check-in. I would like to take you to dinner as a man who has been waiting 6 weeks to have a conversation with a woman he thinks is extraordinary." She looked at him. She said, "You should meet Hope first." He went very still. He said, "You mean?" She said, "I mean that before anything else happens, before any conversation about us, I need you to meet her, because she's not a sidebar. She's the whole thing. And if this is real, then that's where it starts." He held her gaze. He said, "When?" She said, "Saturday. My apartment. 2 o'clock. She'll be up from her nap, and she'll probably stare at you for 20 minutes before she decides whether she likes you." He said, "What if she doesn't like me?" She said with a smile, "Then we're done before we start." He said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." He showed up on Saturday at 1:58. Not early to seem eager, not late to seem casual, but 2 minutes before, which told her something. He showed up with a small thing, not flowers, not anything grand, but very small, very soft stuffed rabbit that he had clearly thought about, and she noted that he had thought about it without saying anything. Hope was awake and in her bouncer in the living room when he came in. Callie introduced them with the informality of someone who is not making a performance of something important. Grant crouched down to Hope's level. Actually crouched without ceremony, and he looked at her and she looked at him. Hope stared at him for 17 minutes. Callie counted. She always counted when the world was doing something important. Then Hope reached out with one small, decisive hand and grabbed his finger. Callie was across the room pretending to be occupied with something on the kitchen counter. She was not fooling anyone. Probably she had her back to them, and her eyes were very bright. She heard Grant say quietly to her daughter, "Hi," and Hope, in the way of babies who have not yet learned to perform themselves for other people, said a sound back that was not yet a word but carried the particular weight of one. Callie turned around. Grant was sitting on the floor now, had moved from crouching to sitting with the instinctive practicality of someone who has decided to be where someone else is, and he was looking at Hope with an expression that was completely unguarded and privately enormous. Callie stood in her kitchen doorway and felt the last resistance in herself. The professional wall, the not yet, the careful and the cautious, shift, not break, shift, make room. She said she likes you. He looked up. He said, "She's extraordinary." Callie said, "I know." He said, "She has your stubbornness." She said, "She's 8 months old." He said, "It's still very visible." She laughed. Hope, startled by the laugh, made the sound again, and Grant looked back at her with the enormous private expression, and Callie went to the kitchen and made tea and let this moment exist exactly as it was. They spent 4 hours in her apartment. They ate the food she had made. She had cooked, not to impress, but because cooking was how she showed care, and she had stopped pretending she did not want to show it. They sat on her floor and played with Hope, and he was easy with her, not practiced, not performing. Just easy, with the ease of someone who is comfortable and has no agenda. At 6 o'clock, Hope started the pre-bedtime ritual, the specific, escalating, unmistakable fussiness that Callie knew how to read, and Grant stood to leave, and she walked into the door, and he turned and he said, "Thank you." She said, "For dinner?" He said, "For this, for trusting me with her." She looked at him. She said, "I don't trust easily." He said, "I know." She said, "And yet." He said, "And yet." She leaned forward. One beat a decision, fast and clear, and she kissed him. Brief, not tentative, real. He stood very still for 1 second after. Then he put his hand on her face gently, and he kissed her back, and it was the way things are when they've been waiting long enough that all the waiting has made them very certain. She stepped back. She said, "Hope is going to need her bath." He said, "Call me when she's down." She said, "It'll be 8:30. He said, "I'll be awake." She closed the door. She leaned her back against it for exactly one breath. Then she went to get Hope and run the bath. She called him at 8:37. He answered before the second ring. They talked for 2 hours. What came next was not without its complications. Nothing real ever is. There was the question of how to handle professional dimension. They were no longer in an active engagement, but she had been referred as industry contacts, and he remained a presence in her professional orbit, and they both understood that the line had to be drawn clearly and maintained rigorously. They talked about this with the same directness they brought to everything. They made agreements. Not rules, agreements. The kind that come from two people who respect each other enough to have the difficult conversation before it becomes necessary. There was the question of what it meant for Hope. This was the one that Callie returned to with the most care. She did not want Hope to become attached to a presence that might not be permanent. She did not want to be careless with her daughter's emotional landscape. She spoke to her mother about it at length over 2 consecutive Sunday calls. Her mother listened and then said, "The question isn't whether it's risky. The question is whether he's worth the risk." Callie said, "How do I know that?" Her mother said, "You already know. You've known for months. The question you're asking isn't whether he's worth it. The question you're asking is whether you're allowed to have it." She sat with that for a while. She was allowed to have it. There was also, in month 2 of their relationship, a development that neither of them had seen coming. The compliance investigation at Voss Infrastructure, the one that had stemmed from Callie's discovery of the environmental documentation fraud, had moved into federal territory. The acquisition manager had retained counsel. Federal investigators had begun examining the outside contractor who had been paying him, and in the course of that examination, they had found a connection that went deeper than the Voss transactions. The contractor had been engaged in similar arrangements with 3 other infrastructure companies across the country. This became, briefly, a significant piece of national news. Voss Infrastructure was not the primary subject. They were, in the narrative, the company that had discovered and reported the fraud, which was a very different position, but the name was in the coverage. Grant handled it with the same composure. He brought to everything. He was precise and transparent and available, and the story ran for a week and then moved on to the next thing stories move on to. But on the evening of the day the story broke, he came to her apartment, not to talk about the coverage, not to debrief. He came and he sat on her couch, and he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, not controlled, but spent. She sat next to him. She did not say anything for a while. Hope was already asleep. The apartment was its nighttime self. He said, "I missed it." She said, "You missed it for 4 years. Then you found it." He said, "I should have found it sooner." She said, "That's how it works with things that are designed to be hidden. He said, I'm supposed to know my own company. She said, you do know your company. You know it well enough to have built it from one regional contract to 52 projects in 12 states. You know it well enough to have given someone full access to find problems you couldn't see yourself. That's not weakness. That's how good companies work. He looked at her. He said, you found it. She said, you brought me in to find things. He said, most advisors don't find things like that. Most advisors protect the people who hire them by not finding things like that. She said, I know. That's why you should have higher standards for the people you hire. He almost laughed. She said, I mean it. Don't bring in people who will tell you what you want to hear. You're too good at this for that. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, how are you this clear about everything? She said, I'm not clear about everything. He said, you seem clear about everything. She said, I'm clear about the things I can analyze. I'm deeply unclear about a lot of things. I'm unclear about whether I'm doing right by Hope. I'm unclear about whether the hallway engagement is going to work the way I think it is. I'm unclear about, she stopped. He said, about what? She said, about whether I deserve this. You, this, all of it at once. A pause. I spent so long just surviving things and having everything be good at the same time is unfamiliar, and I keep waiting for the thing that's going to go wrong. He said, something will go wrong eventually. She said, I know. He said, we'll figure out. She said, you don't know that. He said, no, but I know us well enough to believe it. He paused. I've spent 11 years building things I was certain about because certainty felt safe. You're the first thing in 11 years that I'm not certain about, and I'm not afraid of it. She looked at him. She said, why not? He said, because uncertain things that are worth it feel different from uncertain things that aren't. You feel worth it. She put her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The apartment was quiet. The city was outside. She said, I'm still terrified half the time. He said, I know. She said, stop saying that. He said, stop being so legible. She laughed. It was a Rayall laugh, the one from the middle of something solid. The Holloway engagement began in January. It was, as she had expected and prepared for, complex in ways that were both professional and personal. She walked into that building with her team and her access badge and her 47-page initial brief, and she thought about the woman who had walked out of it 14 months earlier with a manila envelope and 11 seconds accounting. The two women were not different from each other. They were the same woman at different points in a journey that had not been finished when she left and was not finished now. The woman leaving was not defeated, and the woman returning was not triumphant. Both of them were just Callie, paying attention, moving forward, carrying what needed to be carried. Margaret Holloway met her in the lobby on the first day. She walked her to the elevators herself. Not to the 42nd floor, not to the conference rooms Callie remembered, but to the building's top floor, which had been recently converted to a modern, open leadership suite. She brought her into a corner office with a view, and she said, this is yours for the duration of the engagement. Callie looked at the office. She said, this is generous. Margaret said, this is appropriate. She paused. I want this to work, not just the assessment. All of it, what it represents. She looked at Callie directly. The four other women. Two of them are rebuilding their careers. One of them has started her own company. One of them has left the industry. She paused. I want the thing you're doing here to matter for all of them. Callie said, it will. She meant it. She worked the hallway engagement with the same completeness she had brought to everything. She went into every department. She sat with employees at every level, not just leadership, the assistants, the analysts, the support staff. She asked people what it felt like to work there. She asked what they were afraid to say out loud. She sat with those answers, and she built a picture of a culture that had developed its worst habits under cover of its own momentum. She was 6 weeks in when something happened that she had not expected. She was at a meeting with a mid-level manager, a young woman in her early 30s, new to the firm, nervous in a particular way of people who are trying to say a true thing in a place that has not always rewarded truth. And the young woman said, quietly, I heard why you left. Before. The first time. She paused. I want you to know that when I heard you're coming back, I thought, maybe this place can be different. Callie looked at her for a moment. She said, "That's why I'm here." The young woman said, "Can I ask you something?" Callie said yes. The young woman said, "Were you scared when you came back?" Callie said, "Yes." The young woman said, "How did you do it anyway?" Callie said, "I thought about my daughter, and I thought about you, and I thought about the person who would be sitting in this office in 2 years if I didn't come back and do the work, and that was enough." The young woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Callie said, "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when the work is done." The work was not done. It was going to take a long time. It was going to be difficult in ways she had not fully mapped yet. But she was here. She was doing it. And in the long calculation of her life, the one that had started in a small Ohio town with a mother who worked double shifts and a father who left quietly, this was what the whole long arc had been moving toward. Not a settlement, not a victory, exactly a room, a young woman, a question about fear. And the answer that was true, while the Holloway engagement was in its 3rd month, Grant Voss went to Chicago for 2 weeks on a project. They talked every evening. Not long calls. Both of them had things to do. But every evening, without fail, one of them called the other, and they talked for 30 or 40 minutes about whatever the day had held, and then they said good night. The consistency of it was, she had no word for exactly, sustaining. The consistency was sustaining in a way she had not known she was missing until it was there. On his last night in Chicago, he called and he said, "There's something I want to talk to you about, in person." She said, "Good or difficult?" He said, "Personal." She said, "Okay." He came back on a Thursday. He called her Friday morning and said, "Dinner tonight? Your place." She said, "I'll cook." He came at 7. Hope was awake, and he sat on the floor with her for half an hour while Callie finished cooking, and they did the thing that had become, she realized with quiet, startled clarity, their version of a Friday evening. Him and Hope on the floor, and her at the stove, and the apartment warm, and the city outside. And this particular configuration of people that felt like it had been happening forever, even though it had only been happening for 4 months. After Hope was down, they ate. The conversation was easy, as it always was. And when the dinner was finished and the dishes were in the sink, they sat on the couch and he was quiet for a moment in a purposeful way that told her he was finding the words. He said, "I want to tell you about my marriage." She went still. She said, "You've never mentioned." He said, "I know. I've been trying to find the right time." He paused. It was a long time ago. I was 29. She was someone I cared about very much, but who I was with at a point in my life when I was not present enough for anyone. The company was 3 years old. I was working 20-hour days and traveling constantly, and I was not there. Not really. He paused. He said, "She left. She was right to leave. We're not in contact now, but I hope she's well, and I think she probably is." Another pause. What I carry from it is the understanding that I was so focused on building something that I forgot there were people around me who needed the version of me that wasn't working. She said, "You seem different now." He said, "I hope I am. The company is different now. I lead it differently. I trust people. I'm present." He looked at her. "I'm telling you this because I want you to know the whole picture, not just a version of me you've seen for a year. All of it." She said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, "There's more." She said, "Okay." He said, "I've been thinking about something for a while. I didn't want to say it too soon because I didn't want it to be too much pressure. But I also think you should know because you deserve to have all the information when you're deciding anything." She said, "Grant." He said, "I'm in love with you." The apartment was quiet. The city was outside. The dishes were in the sink, and her daughter was asleep in the next room. And this man was sitting on her couch in his Friday evening version of himself. No jacket, no performance. And he had just said the truest thing she had heard in a long time. She said, "How long?" He said, "November." The settlement phone call. The way you said we all did it. And I knew you meant it. And I knew you would have meant it even if you'd done the whole thing alone. I knew then. She was quiet. He said, "You don't have to." She said, I'm in love with you, too. She paused. I've been in love with you since January, possibly October. I've been trying to establish the exact date for professional record-keeping purposes, and the answer is that it was gradual and irreversible, and I'm not afraid of it. He was quiet. Then, "You're not afraid of it," she said. "You're the first thing in a long time that I'm not afraid of." He was the one who reached for her this time. He put his hand on her face the way he had at her door that first time, and he looked at her for a moment, one long, clear, fully present moment. And she looked back and let herself be looked at, which was a harder thing, the braver thing, because Callie Monroe could walk into a glass-walled conference room and count to 11 and walk out, and she could rebuild herself from nothing and take on a firm in a national legal team and bring the most powerful man she had ever met a report about a $40 million problem. But being looked at, being fully seen by someone who was looking for real and finding what was actually there, that required a different kind of courage. She had it. She had worked for it. She had earned it. What happened next was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was quiet and certain and completely right, the way things are when you've gotten through all the difficulty to arrive somewhere real. In the months that followed, things changed and things stayed the same. The changes were the kind that you feel before you can name them. Her apartment started having 2 toothbrushes. Hope started recognizing the sound of a specific car engine and going still and listening for the door. Patrick started texting Callie at 9 in the morning when something had happened that he knew Grant would not mention unless someone else mentioned it first. And she texted back, and they had developed, without discussion, a communication channel that felt like what it was. 2 people who loved the same difficult, extraordinary man and were glad about the company. The same things. She was still herself. Methodical, clear-eyed, honest to a degree that occasionally startled people who were used to more performance. She still took the subway, sometimes even when the car was available, because it kept her grounded in the city she had arrived in with nothing. She still called her mother every Sunday. Hope was 9 months old, and then 11 months old, and then 1 year old. And on the morning of her first birthday, Callie stood in the kitchen making the small cake she had decided to make herself, from a recipe her mother had given her, the one she had gotten from her own mother, and she thought about the bathroom floor at 7:15 in the morning, and the 2 pink lines, and the wonder she had felt. She had been right to feel wonder. The thing she had been wondering about had turned out to be the best thing in her life. Grant came that afternoon with Hope's present. Not the stuffed rabbit. Something else. Something he'd spent time on. A small silver bracelet with a single charm. A tiny star, modest enough for a 1-year-old and meant to grow with her. He put on Hope's wrist, and Hope looked at it, and then looked at him, and then did the thing she had started doing recently where she lifted her arms in a particular, emphatic way that means up, "Hold me, you are mine." He picked her up. He held her the way he had gotten comfortable holding her over the past months. Confidently, naturally, like someone who had made room for it. Callie stood in her kitchen, and she looked at them, and she let herself feel it without cataloging it, without analyzing it, without counting or measuring or defending against it. She just felt it, full, real, hers. Sandra called that week with the final paperwork from the settlement. The last documents were signed. The case was formally closed. The public acknowledgement had been issued. The other 4 women had received their resolutions. The third-party monitoring had been installed. It was done. Callie signed the last paper and sent it back. She sat in her office at Monroe Advisory Group, her real office now, the one with the view she had chosen, and the team she had hired and the name on the door in the exact font she had specified, and she sat for a moment with the fact of it. Done. She thought about the glass-walled conference room. She thought about Margaret and the word restructuring. She thought about the 11 seconds. She thought about the elevator going down, and the revolving door, and the 1 minute on the sidewalk with her hand on her stomach. She thought about the document she had brought to Sandra's office. 63 pages. The clarity of her own anger organized into something useful. She thought about the $14 and the peanut butter sandwiches and the laboratory equipment at 6 in the morning, and the girl who had applied for every scholarship she could find, because she understood that a single paragraph might be the difference between a future and the absence of one. She had written that paragraph. She had written many of them, and they had all been worth it. There was one more thing she did not know yet. One more turn in the story that was still coming. It came in May. She was at the Holloway engagement, now in its 5th month, moving well, genuinely changing things, and she was reviewing a document with her team when Margaret Holloway's assistant appeared and said that Margaret would like to see her. She went up to the top floor. Margaret was at her desk. She looked up when Callie came in and she said, "Sit down." Callie sat. Margaret said, "My husband has decided to step back fully. The transition is happening in August." She paused. "We have been discussing what the new leadership structure should look like. The board has been involved." She paused again. "We would like to offer you a role." Callie said, "What kind of role?" Margaret said, "Advisory board, non-executive, strategic oversight." She paused. "With equity." Callie went still. Margaret said, "I want the person who rebuilt this company to be connected to it in a real way, not as a consultant, as a stakeholder." She paused. "You would maintain Monroe Advisory Group. This would be a separate, limited commitment, but it would put you in the room where the long-term direction is decided." Callie said, "Why me?" Margaret said, "Because you're the most rigorous thinker I have encountered in 40 years in this industry. Because you have a personal understanding of what this firm has to repair that no external advisor could replicate. And because," she paused, "I believe that having your name associated with what this firm is becoming sends a message that no press release can send." Callie was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'll need to think about it." Margaret said, "Of course." She went back to her conference room. She sat with it. She called Grant. He answered on the second ring. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does your gut say?" She said, "My gut says yes." He said, "Then yes." She said, "It's not that simple." He said, "I know, but sometimes it is." She thought about it for 3 days. She talked to Sandra about the legal implications. She talked to her team about what it would mean for Monroe Advisory Group. She talked to her mother, who said, with the straightforward pride of a woman who had seen her daughter build something from nothing, "This is what it looks like when things come all the way around." She said yes. The announcement was made in June. It was a small item in the financial press. Advisory board appointment. Monroe Advisory Group founder. Callie Monroe joins Holloway and reads strategic leadership. The kind of story that means a lot to the people who understand what it took to get there and means very little to everyone else. Callie read it from her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. Hope was in her high chair eating what appeared to be the majority of a cracker. Grant was at the counter making coffee. He brought her a cup and set it down, and he looked at the article over her shoulder, and he said, with quiet pleasure, "There it is." She said, "There it is." He said, "What are you feeling?" She said, "Gratitude. Mostly." He said, "Not pride." She said, "Pride is for other people. Gratitude is for what you've actually been given." He said, "What have you been given?" She looked at Hope. She looked at him. She looked at her coffee cup in the morning light coming through the kitchen window, and the city that had been indifferent to her when she arrived, and that she had made her own through sheer, relentless, faithful attention. She said, "Everything." He kissed the top of her head. Hope said a sound at both of them that was not quite a word, but was clearly an opinion. Callie laughed. Grant laughed. The city went on outside. And Callie Monroe, who had been fired for being pregnant and told by silence and circumstance and a manila envelope across a cold table that she was not enough. Callie Monroe, who had counted to 11 and stood up and smoothed her blazer and walked out, sat in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning in May with her daughter and her person and her future, and she was enough. She had always been enough. The only question had ever been whether the world would catch up to that. It had. It did. And she was just getting started. If you made it all the way here, you are the reason this channel exists. Please hit subscribe right now if you haven't already. Share this with someone who needs to hear this story today. And drop a comment below telling us the moment that got you. We have more stories coming. Ones that will make you laugh, cry, stay up way too late, and feel every single thing. Don't miss a single one.